In the words of that well-known social critic and philosopher, Britney Spears, oops, he did it again. Oops. Once again, Jesus told the tale that drove his message home by using a socially despised character as the hero. And not only that, this time he added another element. He added a fail, just to get the discussion going. Really, it wasn't just a fail, it was an epic fail. You know what an epic fail is, right? According to the dictionary, the Urban Dictionary, where I get all of my definitions these days because I'm just that kind of hip. According to the Urban Dictionary, an epic fail is a complete and total failure when success should have been reasonably easy to attain. Or, another definition is, when something can be seen as a total failure. Now, in case you're not into words so much, but you're more into the visual definitions of things, we have the example of a man named Vinko Bogataj. You pull the video up, please. You might know this one. It is so epic that generations of TV viewers have grown up seeing that. That's the very definition of the agony of defeat. Today it's the definition of an epic fail. I understand he is one of the 20 most well-known sports figures in the world. And at an anniversary celebration for Wide World of Sports, Muhammad Ali came up to him to get an autograph. That's how epic it was. But Jesus sets us up, or actually he sets up both dramatic elements of the story when he begins to tell this tale of two very different men. One of them is a Pharisee, somebody who is regarded as socially acceptable. Not just socially acceptable, actually, but socially admirable. And not coincidentally, perhaps because of this station in life, he was something of a proud man. And the other man in the story was a tax collector. From a social standpoint, probably somewhere between a shepherd and a leper. Because tax collectors, for the most part, were social pariahs. They were despised by anyone in polite society. Now, of course, several of Jesus' most memorable stories have been about characters who were in stark contrast to one another. You had the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and the parable of the two brothers from the prodigal son. And we have these two men. You know that if you're familiar with Jesus' parables and his teachings. And if you're familiar with his teachings, you also know that Jesus seems to enjoy riffing on the Pharisees quite a bit. But before we really dig into this parable, I want to say a word in the defense of the Pharisees, which won't happen very often. The Pharisees as a class were a relatively recent development in Jewish culture. The word itself comes from the Greek Phariseus, which is their version of the words peris or perisim, which are Hebrew words that mean to set something apart or to set someone apart. And the roots of the Pharisees go back to the scramble that went on during the Babylonian exile for the people to try to hold on to their history, the Jewish history and the Jewish culture. That's when the Pharisees started to take shape. And as a group, they really blossomed after the Greeks took control of the Holy Land, and then the Maccabees revolted around 2nd century BC. And there was a brief period of independence. The Pharisees were a party and a class of scribes and scholars that intentionally set themselves apart from the rest of society. Because the rest of society was going on this, as they saw it, this kind of long, decadent slide toward Greek culture. And the Pharisees stood as a bulwark against that. They were essentially kind of the old guard, clinging to the laws of Moses and to that understanding of God's covenant with Israel that they had. Pharisees were known for being devout. That comes up in the parable. Pharisees fasted twice a week, which only the most devout Jews did. And they made a regular practice of tithing 10% of everything they earned to the church, to the temple. As a class, the Pharisees operated from the premise that they knew exactly what was right and what was proper according to the laws of God. So they honestly were, in some sense at least, these were men to be admired for their faith and for their devotion in the face of a pagan culture. But by Jesus' time, 1st century AD, early to mid-1st century, the faith and devotion in many of these Pharisees had sort of turned into being parodies of these qualities of faith and devotion. By focusing on minutiae, the Pharisees sometimes lost track of the grander sweep of God's grace and mercy. They focused on the little things, not the big picture. And by obsessing over kind of keeping score, essentially they ended up foundering on the rocks of their own pride and their own thoughts about how well they were doing in their job. And that's where the epic fail of the Pharisees' prayer comes in. And I put air quotes around prayer because what we had here, what Jesus reported in his story, was not really a prayer at all. True, he went to the temple and he stood before the altar and he opened his hands and he looked up to God in an attitude of prayer, but then listen to what he said. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. Thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all my income. When you think about that, and at best, what this guy is saying is, God, thank you for making me better than all these people. Thieves and adulterers and this stooge for Rome. Thank you for making me a holy man who is better than everybody else. Which is not much of a prayer. It's kind of a fail. And that's at best. At worst, he's actually up there doing, instead of a prayer, he's doing some humble bragging. You know what humble bragging is? It's when you pretend to be humble about something, but you're really bragging. I feel so uncultured when I go on all these foreign trips abroad and I just don't speak the language. Oh, I felt silly being bumped up to first class and then sitting next to Jennifer Aniston, and I wanted to read my book and she wanted to talk. That's a humble brag. So the Pharisee was not praying. Not in the sense of expressing heartfelt gratitude to God or turning your heart to God. Trying to connect. If there was a message in his prayer, it was not certainly thank you. It was, I'm better than all you guys. And God and I both know it. So the epic fail of it was that we had a man who had everything going for him. He had the education to understand why he should be thankful. He had the upbringing to know better. And yet when the time came to show gratitude, instead of doing that, he showed nothing but self-righteousness and a misplaced sense of superiority. In a public prayer, he exposed his most private and personal shortcomings as a human being, let alone a supposedly faithful man of God. So the Pharisee stands in sharp contrast to the tax collector. The tax collector in that day and age should have been the villain of the story. Or at least he should have been the antagonist. As far as society in first century Palestine was concerned, being a tax collector was not a profession that made you socially desirable or even socially acceptable. Well, at least not acceptable to another class that cared about morals anyway, or cared about human values. Tax collectors, first century. They were not civil servants. They were businessmen who had gotten the job as tax collectors by bidding for it with the imperial Roman government. It was a pretty sweet deal. Because the Roman government, you remember, thousands of miles away, didn't want to be bothered with counting noses and collecting money on a regular basis in their outlying territories. So instead they calculated how much revenue they thought they should collect from a region. And then the businessmen would bid on the rights to collect taxes in that region, guaranteeing that they would collect at least that minimum amount. Or maybe just a little bit more to kind of grease the wheels. In some cases, these businessmen would even be required to pay all of that up front, just to acquire the collection rights. And in return for that, then, the imperial government would back the tax collector with the full power of the Roman army to collect taxes. And as they collected taxes, any surplus that happened to come their way would stay in their pockets. It was a pretty good deal all the way around unless you were a taxpayer. And remember, down at the village level, these bids would be put in by very rich and influential businessmen, possibly even syndicates of businessmen to raise money. But down at the village level, the people that were actually collecting the taxes would probably be locals. Locals working with the businessmen who had won the right to collect taxes. So any ill will that was felt toward these people went beyond just disliking them because they were generally dishonest, but they were also despised and disliked because they were Jews and they were working for the man. They were working for Rome. They were sellouts. In it for the money. And that whole arrangement, if you know anything about how the Nazis ran their concentration camps and their death camps in World War II, the whole arrangement made me think about how the Nazis used what they called capos. At a low level within the camps, order was maintained by other prisoners who were picked out of the lineup, usually because they were big and mean, or you could tell that they had no scruples. And these people were picked out and they were made capos. And they were put in charge of the other prisoners. These were Jews who worked for Nazis. And within the camps and within the society, they were despised for it. I was thinking this week that the tax collectors were probably held in somewhat the same regard as capos would be 2,000 years later. They would be feared, but not respected. They would be reviled for turning their backs on their own people. And of course, there's the twist. There is the twist, because this unrighteous, wretched, despised, reviled human being, he's the one who turns out to be the one who prays sincerely. He's the one who truly does reach out to God. He's the one who truly does understand who and what he is. In this parable, he turns out to be the hero of the story, if there is one. Now, if you've been a follower of Jesus at the time and you've heard this story maybe for the first time, it's been a bit shocking. When this last twist came in and this scumbag of a human being turned out to be the good guy, you might have been puzzled. You might have even been confused, and I think if you were, Jesus would have been happy. Because Jesus knew that to make people begin to think differently about who God was and about their relationship with God and about what their relationship with their fellow human beings should be, and to show them the universality of their own sinful state, you first would have to shake these people loose from their old ideas. You have to change their old perspectives, their old ways of looking at things. So not unlike using a despised Samaritan as the hero in another parable to show a right relationship with people, Jesus uses this despised tax collector to show a right and respectful relationship with God. Now, to be honest, if you were a follower of Jesus and his teachings, you know that he really telegraphed this twist at the very beginning of the story, when he set the whole story up as a contrast between two very different men in prayer and in the temple. But it would still strike you. And like so many of his parables, the beauty of this one, maybe it's not the beauty, maybe it's the sad part of it, is that 2,000 years later, we still have both kinds of people with us. I mean, if you think about contemporary society today and contemporary religion, we all know somebody like that Pharisee, don't we? We all know somebody who is all too eager to point out the flaws and the failings of others while they don't somehow recognize their own. Maybe some of us have even been that Pharisee now and then. Maybe some of us have even fallen into that trap. In a very meta way, I suppose, we're there when we say, wow, I'm glad I'm not like those hypocritical Pharisees. Guess what? You kind of are. quote another popular phrase, the struggle is real. The struggle to maintain humility in the light of our own faults. And the struggle to remember that we are all the same. Sinners in need of salvation or saints on the long road to heaven, we are all in need of prayer. And we are all here for each other. Or we should be. Not to point fingers, but to reach out in love. Not to condemn, but to comfort. Not to belittle, but to lift up. Not to judge, but to teach and to show a better way. For the glory of God. In Jesus' name. Amen.